طيب أنا عايزة الأول أشكر الدكتورة منى سالم أستاذتي ومعلمتي ومؤسسة وحدة السكر عندنا في جامعة عين شمس، وأشكر الأستاذة الدكتورة منى ممدوح جزيل الشكر على دعوتي للكلام النهاردة. الحقيقة الدكتورة منى ممدوح يعني قالت لي أختار التوبيك اللي أنا عايزاه، فأنا قلت فرصة إن هذا الجمع كله موجود إن إحنا نتاكل pitfalls in insulin therapy. I usually come across many of the pitfalls. هم حاجات محددة، استنباط كده غلط ناس كتيرة بتعملها. ف I thought it would be a good choice إن إحنا نتاكل the pitfalls in insulin therapy of our type 1 diabetic children and adolescents in Egypt. The main pitfalls I usually come across relate لل 6 points اللي قدامكم دي. Due to the time constraints, I would probably, لأنه I'm given only 15 minutes, I will probably focus on the first 3. The first pitfall relates to timing of insulin glargine, ودي حاجة بقالها سنين طويلة. This is a copy and paste of a chat with one of our patients in our clinic. على right side عندكم الchat in Arabic, على left side I put it in English so our international speakers can understand what's going on. The patient is saying her son is 4.5 years old. He is sweaty all night long. During the daytime, the blood glucose is within very acceptable range. But overnight, he suffers from hypos, and every time she measures the blood glucose overnight, she needs to give sugar dissolved in water. He takes Lantus 8 units at night, and he receives mealtime insulin, 5 units for breakfast, 4 for lunch, and 4 for dinner. And she's asking how to avoid the hypos overnight. That is a very common scenario. This is another chat with one other patient. She's saying, my son is 2.5 years old. He's taking 5 units of Lantus at 10:30 p.m. He has to sleep with a blood glucose not below 180. Actually, she makes sure the blood glucose is between 180 to 230, and still he wakes with blood glucose of 60 milligram per deciliter or less. This is a common problem we face. To tackle this problem, I decided to go back to basics. And the basic issue relates to glucose variability along the different stages of puberty in youth with type 1 diabetes. This is a subject that has long been studied, and I decided to choose this article published in 2020 because in 2020 they restudied the whole issue using CGM, using the Dexcom G4, and they assessed all the metrics of glycemia across different stages of puberty. If you look at this curve here, I want you to focus on 2 things, the black circles and the empty squares. The black circles are prepubertal children. The empty squares relate to those in puberty. If you look here at the time interval between 12 a.m. و 6 a.m., اللي هي الفترة اللي هم نايمينها بالليل من نص الليل لغاية 6 الصبح, you will find a significant, the asterisk denotes a p-value below 0.05, which is significant. So you find that there is significant drop in the mean glucose for prepubertal children during this time interval, although they later have higher excursions of the blood glucose, regardless of the type of insulin therapy they are on. يعني احنا عايزين نقول ايه هنا؟ يعني احنا عايزين نقول ان prepubertal children are more liable to hypoglycemia overnight as compared to pubertal children, and they do suffer more significant glucose excursions during the daytime. طبعا دي is related أكتر للglucagon response and the hepatic gluconeogenesis occurring overnight, which is usually stimulated by the sex hormones of puberty, ولذلك بيحصل التغيير as they reach puberty. طيب, looking at glargine 100, please only look at the blue line here. Ignore the green line for now. Glargine 100, which is the Lantus, if you look at the pharmacokinetics of it, it usually starts its onset of action within 1.5 to 2 hours, and then it plateaus for around 12 hours. And then the serum level will drop for the next 12 hours. احنا هنا level at pre-injection level is reached at around 24 hours or a bit less. يعني الجلارجين best pharmacodynamic action you can get is actually within the first 12 hours. What does this translate into? This is the study done. It was a randomized clinical trial done across several centers by the glargine study group itself, published in 2003, when they compared breakfast, dinner, or bedtime administration of glargine 100 in patients with type 1 diabetes. And this is the conclusion of their study. I want you to focus on the yellow circle here. The 24-hour blood glucose profiles were similar across all groups. The incidence of total symptomatic and severe hypoglycemia did not differ between the three groups. However, nocturnal hypoglycemia occurred in significantly fewer patients in the breakfast group as compared to the dinner and the bedtime group. يعني less hypoglycemia overnight if you give it in the morning as compared to the evening or bedtime. Line 4 here tells you that the insulin glargine to total insulin dose ratio increased if you give it in the breakfast time. You will need more insulin if you give it in the breakfast time, but you will have less nocturnal hypoglycemia. And this is a quote I have quoted. Targeting fasting euglycemia appears to be more convenient with evening glargine. Conversely, morning doses may be preferable whenever great protection against the risk of nocturnal hypoglycemia is needed. So this translates into this conclusion. It may be best to give glargine 100 or Lantus in the morning for prepubertal children to reduce the risk of nocturnal hypoglycemia, while as children enter into puberty, a shift can be made to PM or evening injection. طبعا once they are adults, it is always evening injection. The other thing relates to the timing of insulin glargine 300. Bardo, this is a chat from one of our patients who sent, the patient is an adolescent. The mother sent this chat on the right, which means that her pre-breakfast reading of her child is high, 237. After breakfast is 304. Before lunch is 215. After lunch is 252. Before dinner is 237. After it is 128. And she's giving to Jayo at 9 p.m. 15 units. And at dawn, the blood glucose is 139. And she is afraid of overnight hypoglycemia if she raises the dose of Toujeo. Meanwhile, she is worried that she was, in the Arabic chat, she's even writing the food because she's making very strict restrictions on diet, not allowing the child except to eat very small quantities of food. Even though she's doing this, the blood glucose readings are high during the daytime. Back to basics. If you now look, just focus on the green line and ignore the blue line of Lantus. The green line is for insulin glargine 300. After injecting glargine, it will start acting within around 2 hours, just like Lantus. And then it will plateau for around 16 hours. And then the level will start gradually decreasing. And at around 25 hours, we reach the pre-injection level. Okay? So for Toujeo, we actually have around 18 hours of good insulin level. But this study was done to assess the glucagon response and the lipids and ketone bodies in insulin-treated type 1 diabetics treated with glargine unit 300. And I want you to focus on the graph in the middle, which is the glucagon level in relation to injecting the glargine 300. The dark black triangles are those for glargine 300, and the empty triangles are for Lantus. For Toujeo or glargine 300, as you look at the effect on glucagon, the best drop in glucagon is actually in the second 12 hours after injection. It is not during the first 12 hours. It is actually in the second 12 hours after injection. And this led to conducting this multicentric study, which was done across the United States, France, Germany, and Italy. And they tried to administer 0.4 unit per kg per day of glargine 300. 0.4 unit per kg is the usual dose for an adult type 1 diabetic. And they found that administering it in the morning, based on what I showed you, provides less fluctuating 24-hour pharmacodynamic and more even pharmacokinetic profile compared with degludec 100. So what is our conclusion? I put the conclusion here in gray, because if you actually do review the literature, you will find 3 studies talking about morning Toujeo and how morning Toujeo is much better, especially that it will affect the gluconeogenesis and suppress hepatic production of glucose in the later 12 hours, not the first 12 hours after injection. And you will find several studies talking about the evening injection of Toujeo. So I put the conclusion in gray, but based on practice, it is worth considering this. We usually give glargine 300 in post-pubertal kids. These are the kids that need large doses of basal insulin, and they are the ones that receive usually the Toujeo or glargine 300. In those kids, it is worth exploring the patient response to giving the insulin in the morning instead of the evening. A trial of Toujeo in the morning is worth considering in post-pubertal children. And believe me, it is best. Now, the other pitfall 2 relates to timing of basal in relation to bolus insulin. I brought this graph just to remind you of the NPH, which we almost are not using anymore now. The NPH has a peak around 4 hours, okay? Glargine does not have this peak, and we already discussed the pharmacokinetics of glargine 100 and 300. Looking at the gludec 100, or Tresiba, it will start its action after 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours. By 6 hours, it is going to reach its peak, and the peak continues for around 18 hours. After 18 hours, the serum level will gradually drop until about 30 hours. Okay, what does this translate into? We have a real myth conveyed by all patients إنه دايما العيان يقول يا دكتور أنا ما أقدرش آخد النوفو رابيد مع التريسيبا، أو أنا هأخر الهومالوج لما بعد شوية بآخد التوجيو أو آخد اللانتوس أو آخد التريسيبا. This is a myth. ليه؟ لأنه الانسولين, if you look at the regular insulin we used to use in the past, the peak of action بتاعته is at around 3 to 4 hours. The peak of NPH used to occur at around 4 hours. يعني when we used to use regular and NPH insulin, there will be a coinciding peak of both insulins. في هذه الحالة, either the patient is going to snack to avoid hypoglycemia, which is easy to do during daytime, أو إن إحنا نفصل التو insulins عن بعض during nighttime to avoid the risk of hypoglycemia overnight. Now, if we look at the newer insulin analogs we have, سواء الاسبرو اللي هو الهيومالوج, aspart, النوفو رابيد, أو الجلوليزين, which is Apidra, their peak is at around half an hour to 1 hour. واحنا بنتكلم إنه أساساً الدجلوداك ده هيبدأ يشتغل بعد 2-3 ساعات. أو لو إحنا حتى بنتكلم على الجلارجين insulin, whatever the type, we are speaking about a window of 1.5 to 2 hours. So actually it's the reverse. If you do give them together, you are avoiding the risk of superimposed peaks and أو حتى insulin levels. You will have the peak of the rapid acting analog. You will finish this peak before the onset of action of the basal insulin starts. I have put a screenshot of this table from the ISPAD, and if you look here, to make it even clearer, At the rapid-acting insulin analogs, which is the second line, the first are the ultra-rapid-acting, which we don't have yet. The rapid-acting insulin analogs, the peak of action is at around 1 to 3 hours. Now go down here to the basal long-acting insulin, the glargine or the glargine 300 or degludec. You will find their onset of action is between 1.5 to 2 hours to start their action. So if you do give the short-acting analog with the long-acting basal analog, you are actually getting done with the peak of the short-acting before the long-acting start acting and reducing the risk of hypoglycemia. Pitfall 3 relates to doses of puberty, and I will come back to the same case that I presented earlier of the mother who is restricting the food intake of her child. She's giving Toujeo 15 units at night, and she's having to give 8 units of NuvoRapid for dinner, 10 for lunch, 8 for breakfast. She's giving a total of 26 units, doing very strict restrictions on diet, and despite that, the blood glucose is still out of range. And this is a quote from the ISPAD, and it says that prepubertal children outside the honeymoon usually require 0.7 to 1 unit per kg per day. As you all know, once we are using a basal bolus regimen, it's 50-50, 50% basal, 50% bolus. During puberty, the requirements may rise substantially above 1 and even up to 2 units per kg per day. So going back to our example, this patient was under-insulinized regarding the basal insulin, was receiving much more bolus insulin, and what we did is we went gradually to increase her Toujeo dose to 39 units because she was entering puberty. She was actually in Tanner 2. And we increased the dose gradually. We needed to reach a dose of Toujeo 39 units to achieve satisfactory glycemic control. And we went back, and we actually changed the timing to morning injection, and it went quite well. Some final conclusions because of time restraints. I was told to just speak for 15 minutes. So these are the other pitfalls I put at the beginning, but I will just mention them briefly. Whenever one of the pitfalls we do is when you give a correction dose, patients tend to measure their blood glucose rapidly, shortly after the correction. They will take a correction dose of Humalog or NuvoRapid, and they will measure the blood glucose half an hour, 40 minutes after the correction. And they are not happy with what the dose has done, and they give another correction, and so forth. Please remember that you have to follow the action profile of the insulin you are using for correction doses. Meaning, لو أنا بدي هيومالوج أو أبيدرا أو نوفورابيد، أنا لازم أدي الإنسولين فرصته ساعتين يشتغل معايا بالأكشن بتاعته، عشان أنا لو رجعت هنا بصوا it will peak around half an hour. يعني العيال لما قاسوا بعد نص ساعة عمل إيه؟ ما عملش حاجة، هو ما لحقش يشتغل أساسا. يعني إيه أنا خدت دوز أوف كوركشن ولسه السكر منزل؟ ما هو طبيعي ما نزلش، هو لسه الإنسولين ما اشتغلش يا جماعة. فإحنا محتاجين ندي وقت. You need to give around 1 to 2 hours if you are giving a short-acting insulin analog. If you are giving regular human insulin, especially in our hospitals, please allow around 4 hours. Allow the insulin to peak. على الأقل الإنسولين يبيك, and we get the action before giving another correction dose. The other thing regarding insulin to carb ratios, الحقيقة برضو دي فيها العجب. Using variable insulin to carb ratios for different meals, and للأسف I don't have the time to go through it, but if you read through the literature, our type 1 diabetic youth are more insulin resistant in the morning, are more insulin sensitive in the evening, which is why they are more liable for nocturnal hypoglycemia. When you give an insulin to carb ratio, هتلاقوا في literature it is described that you need to calculate a different dose during the morning time, especially for breakfast, as compared to the evening meal or dinner time. It is totally different. Otherwise, if you use the same insulin to carb ratio, there is a high chance your child or adolescent will go into nocturnal hypoglycemia. الحاجة التانية, this is also crucial لأن إحنا الادolescents بتوعنا بيبقوا حاسين هي عاملة زي it is not a fight. يعني diabetes management is not a fight. It is a teamwork and agreement. فالادولescent when they find out أنا محروم من كذا ومحروم restricted وعامل insulin to carb ratio مش ماشي معايا كويس, they tend to overdose الانسولين. اللي احنا قاعدين كل شويه نقول the Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and they actually overdose الانسولين. يعني اكتر حاجه بقت بتعمل hypoglycemia في الادولescents انه they tend to overdose الانسولين to have the freedom of eating. Please avoid this and do calculate a different insulin to carb ratio for the different meals. آخر حاجة برضو الانسولين البيشنتس اللي على continuous insulin infusion or insulin pumps. One of the problems عندنا للأسف يعني هي برضو related للشركة إنه they tend to put a fixed basal rate أو 2 basal rates in the pump. This way we are not making the maximum benefit of what we have. إحنا معانا 6 to 8 basal rates that we can adjust in the pump. Major advantage of the pump مش إن أنا بريح العيان ولا الكلام الفارغ ده كله. The major advantage I can vary the basal rate along the day according to the lifestyle of my child or adolescent. So you have to use and revise the requirement of the different basal rates along different times of the day to make the best use of the insulin pump you are giving the patient. Thank you very much.